everybody, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using a few of the elements from the Colors of Spring Flavor of the Month card kit from last April because I figured spring is hopefully right around the corner. So I am starting off with a piece of the pattern paper from the kit as well as the stamp set by Stamping Bella. And I'm cutting a strip from Nina Solar White cardstock here and cutting my pattern paper to 5 1/4 by 4, so just slightly smaller than an A2 size card. I'm just lining that strip of white cardstock to make sure that I have enough of that pattern paper showing, but big enough where it's still going to fit my stamp. So I went ahead and put my panels aside. I'm going to be working on the white panel here and stamping my image with blackout ink by Ink on 3, but you can use any Copic safe ink here because obviously I'm going to be coloring her with my Copic markers. So I'm going to start off with her skin tones as I normally do. And I'm starting off with my lightest color, which is the E50, and I'm just mapping out where my darkest areas will be. For the shadows on her, that it's going to be underneath where her hair is and a little bit off to the left-hand side because she's facing towards the right, underneath her arms, on the bottom part of her arms, and where one leg is behind the other, that would cast a shadow. And also there would be some shading on the other leg too. Just make sure that you kind of avoid putting two of the darkest areas directly next to one another. Going in with my darkest color, and I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to my paper here because this is a pretty tiny image, especially her legs and arms are very, very teeny tiny. So you just want to make sure that you're barely touching the paper because any alcohol ink will spread just a little bit once it touches the paper. Next, I'm bringing in the E11, which is my darkest midtone, and I'm spreading out all of that E04 that I had put down. So I'm going directly over the E04 and just making those areas a little bit wider. Doing the same thing with the E01, just extending those areas out even further. And then finally, I will go in with or back in with the E50 and just add in those highlight areas. Now I am taking the R20 and just adding a little bit of color to her cheeks. And I usually flick from the outside of her face towards the center. And if you feel like it's a little bit too pink, you can always take your lightest color, which would be the E50 in this case, and tone that down a little bit. But in this case, being her face is so tiny, it didn't really stand out too much. Next, I'm going to go in with the E18 for her hair. And I typically start off with my darkest color when I color hair. And again, very little areas to work with here. But for her little messy bun here, I'm just going to be flicking up a little bit from each little section of her bun to give it some texture and dimension. I'm also creating flick lines from the top of her head, I guess, and the bottom where her little bangs are hanging down, also creating a shadow underneath her little daffodil headband there. Bringing in the E15, and I'm just going to extend these flicks out even further. Again, I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to my paper here because this is such a teeny tiny area. Next, I'll bring in the E11, which is actually one of the skin tones, but this is just a highlight color for my hair. So it's not necessarily going to blend in with her skin, being we use those darker colors for the shadows. Next, we'll move on to her little dress here. Well, first I cleaned up some of the areas where I was a little messy and my skin tones there and my hair colors went beyond where they were supposed to. So for her dress, I'm going to start off again with the lightest color and I'm going over my darkest areas. So underneath her little flower collar there would cast a shadow, and where her dress is kind of gathered up. So it's kind of like a scalloped line on the bottom part of her dress. Where it points up, I'm creating little teeny tiny triangles. And depending on how much it kind of gathers up depends on the size of my triangle. So some are really, really tiny and some are a little bit longer. It all depends on how much that dress would be gathered in that particular area. For her collar of her dress, I'm just creating some shading on the center part of each of the little petals. did the same thing with the darkest color, going over those same areas that we had mapped out, bringing in the Y08, which is the darkest midtone, and I'm going over all of those areas and extending those out, including my little triangles. So I'm just making those triangles a little bit thicker and a little bit taller, I should say. Same thing for her collar there. I'm just extending those flick lines that we had created in the center of each of the petals. For the lightest midtone, I'm doing the same thing, making those little triangles a little bit wider and a little bit longer and extending all of those shadow areas out on the bottom part of her dress and the collar. Finally going back in with the Y000, and I'm just going to blend the rest of this out. So I'm just basically going over everything to kind of smooth everything out. And those little triangles you'll see actually gives the dress some texture and shows that it's kind of pleated. Going to do the same thing or same color combination for her little headband there. And I'm just going to create a shadow underneath. I don't know different parts of flowers. I love flowers, but I know nothing about them. So I'm just adding some shadows where naturally they would be. So where one part of the flower is kind of hanging over or lying on top of another part of the flower. And I initially colored the headband itself with the same color combination, with just concentrating the shadowing being underneath where the little flower is and on the bottom where it's kind of tucked behind her ear. I will go ahead and change that. For her shoes, this is where I made a mistake. So I initially colored her shoes themselves with the C7 to make them appear to be black because I don't know where my black Copic marker is. So this is the next best thing I have. And it just was not going well with the yellow. It kind of came out of nowhere with the black. Colored the little daffodils on her shoes with the same yellow combination and decided I really hated that black. I needed either more black or I needed to somehow tone that down. So I ended up using some C markers to color the headband portion itself with the C7, C5, and C3, just doing the same type of shading that I did with the yellows, but it didn't look gray or black. It more looked kind of like a grayish greenish color because we went over the yellow. So I'm going to take the Y04 and go directly over that C7 that I had put on her shoes to kind of match that headband a little bit. Now this did bleed a little bit, so I did have to take my colorless blender just to fix up some of those areas. And I wanted to create a shadow so she's just not floating there. So I brought back in my C markers, and I'm just going to start with my C7 and just create a line underneath her and extend that line out to either side and towards the bottom with the C5, C3, and then finally the C1, and kind of blend all of that together, just extending that shadow on either side and towards the bottom. You don't necessarily want to shade up. So once my coloring was complete, I decided to create a border for each one of my panels using black cardstock, again, to kind of bring in some of that black that I had made a terrible choice in using for her shoes. So I'm just creating a mat for both of my panels, just cutting them a teeny tiny bit larger than my panel itself. I'm not really measuring here, just as long as I have a very small border for it. And I placed everything onto a white card base just to make sure everything was going to line up completely. And for my sentiment, I'm actually using the stamp set that came in the banana split level. And I kind of lined that up. I wanted to use this larger sentiment, but I didn't allow myself enough room. So I ended up using the Happy Spring, and I'm stamping this with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Keep in mind that this is a pigment ink, and even though it dries faster than most pigment inks, it will take a minute or two to dry. So kind of just give it some time before you go messing around with your card panel. I did add a bunch of sparkle to her entire dress, including her headband and the little daffodils on her shoes. And I'm going to fix up more areas that continue to bleed. The more color you add, the more likely it is to bleed. So I'm going to adhere my colored or my pattern paper onto my black panel there, and then adhere that flat to my A2 size card base so that I do have a small white border around my pattern paper as well. And then I will take that same Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my colored panel onto another black panel, and then again I adhered this flat. You can certainly pop this up, but I'm a one layer girl, so multiple layers is not something I'm used to. So I decided to adhere that flat down. And I use the wet glue because it gives me more time to kind of move that around to make sure it's centered. But that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.